Hey everyone, Future Dimitri here. As with all first episodes, something was bound to go wrong. Specifically, the audio was a bit too echoey for our tastes, especially near the end. That said, the discussion was too good to throw away, so we did our best to fix it, and we hope you'll hear past the noise and enjoy the show. Thanks. Awesome. Hello and welcome to Code Completion. We are a group of iOS developers and educators hoping to share what we love most about development, Apple technology, and completing your code on this brand new show. My name is Dimitri Bugnol, and I'll be your host for this episode. And I'm joined by my fellow completionists, Ben.
Hey, everyone.
We have Spencer.
How's it going, guys?
And since this is our first show, I figured not everyone knows who we are, so let's start the conversation by going around letting everyone introduce themselves. To keep it short, why don't we all share what our favorite framework is? Spencer, why don't you start?
I think one of my favorite frameworks is CloudKit because it's sort of the first non-traditional sort of general iOS development framework that I learned. And at that time, I didn't know about Vapor or anything with server-side Swift. That was really kind of in its infancy. So that was kind of my first dive into, building sort of a backend for some of my apps.
Awesome. Ben?
I think for me, just because it's so powerful, Core Location and MapKit, they're very much similar and related. And those two frameworks were ones that I really was impressed by when I first started using them. It's kind of amazing how fast you can put something together and get a map and get pins and get your current location, and you can get overlays with directions, and it's just with very little code and really not even a lot of understanding required, you can get something that's very powerful that would be very difficult to do if you had to do that yourself. So, one of my favorites.
And as for myself, I think one of my favorite frameworks is Core Animation. I actually was starting to get really into development when Core Animation came out, and it was called LayerKit in the betas, and you might see that acronym hanging around every now and then. But much like Swift UI is for many of you, our listeners, it was truly game-changing when it came out, how easy it made to make fluid user interfaces. So it really holds a special place in my heart for that reason. So first off, Ben, why don't you tell us about your recent adventures with collection view compositional layouts and diffable data sources?
Sure. So recently, I've worked on both a professional app and an app for myself, where I have needed to do a lot of collection view and table view type work, and I decided that it would be a good excuse to try to learn a little bit more about compositional layouts and diffable data sources, two new frameworks or two new libraries that were made available in iOS 13 and have since been improved on in iOS 14 as well. Both apps that I'm working on right now are both 13, so I can't quite use the newest stuff yet, but I'm excited to check that stuff out. And so it's been a real learning curve for me, somebody who's done a lot of iOS work and built a lot of apps. The way that they want you to manage your table views and your collection views in this new setup is very different. And you have to kind of reorient your brain around using them so that you can be productive. And it's still something that I'm kind of beating my head against the wall a little bit about, even today after using it for a couple of months now. There's still edge cases. I ran into an edge case today that I just couldn't solve. I'll try again on Monday and see what else I can figure out. But basically how it works is in the traditional setup for a table view or a collection view, you have the view itself, you have all the cells that you want to put on the screen, and then you have the data that backs up those views. That's typically called the data source. And the way that it used to work was that you would have a collection of data source elements. So you'd have a collection of models, so like a bunch of people or a bunch of maybe menu items from a menu if you're building an app for a restaurant, something like that, and you have to then get them on the screen. So you've got that array of models, and then you have your cells, and the way that you would do that is through protocol conformance with either the collection view or table view data source protocols or the collection view or table view delegate protocols to manage both getting the cells on the screen and also to responding to events that occur on those cells, so like tapping a cell or something like that. And that process has been around for a long time and works fine. But one of the biggest issues that you run into is if you have a lot of dynamic cell recreation or a weird layout or kind of anything that's beyond sort of the typical everyday type thing, you're going to probably run into problems where you may have seen this before when you're using a table view or a collection view where you're trying to insert or delete items, and it says before the insertion or the deletion there was this many cells, after the event there was this many cells, and the number of cells that it should exist is this other third number. And so the collection view or the table view is telling you that something is wrong with the way that you've managed the addition or deletion of those cells, and it's going to crash. It causes a crash of the app. If you're in debug mode running an Xcode, it's going to throw up a big error for you. If it's not, the app's just going to close. And the solution is probably the order in which you're doing something, or maybe you forgot to do a step. What needs to happen is that the model layer and the view layer need to be in sync. And if they are not, then that can cause those issues. So that's kind of the bane of everyone's existence when you're using these APIs. And one of the ways they've tried to solve that with this new setup is to kind of take some of that work and really make it the responsibility of the model itself to manage through things like making your model identifiable, and also hashable. So what that means is that each model object is uniquely identifiable, and therefore, if that's true, then the table view or the collection view can do a much better job of knowing which model goes with which cell. And if you add or delete things or move things around, it can be smarter about making those changes without you needing to do as much deletion and addition. It used to be that you had to like, let's say, move a cell. You often would delete it from where it was, and then you would create a brand new cell in a new position, a new index path, and you'd paste it in. And that can lead to, if you do that out of order or you don't do the right steps, it can lead to problems. This allows you to do things a little more fluidly, where you can just kind of tell the data source that you want the data source to exist in a particular state, and then you want that data source to apply the changes between what it is now and what it's going to become through diffing, right? Through differentiating between those two data sets and animating those differences automatically. So that's where the diffable comes from in diffable data sources. It's really powerful, really cool, and for the most part works genuinely better than the way that it used to work. And with a few sort of edge case exceptions, I've really been enjoying it. And kind of going with that is the compositional layouts, where what's really cool about that is you can do very complex interactions of cells. So imagine the App Store, right? The App Store app. I can pull up on my phone and give you a quick little view of it. If you haven't seen it, it's gonna be backwards. But right, like here, if we look at this, we can see as we scroll, there's these big cards, and then sometimes there's big cards, sometimes there's a card that contains a table view. Of course, there we go. Like this one, right? This is actually a collection view cell that contains a table view inside of it. And so this kind of layout can be very difficult to create if you need to use the old style APIs. You end up embedding a table view inside a collection view cell, and it can just really get kind of nuts really quick and very difficult to manage. So with compositional layouts, it allows you to design almost like you were designing sort of divs with CSS, like you were styling, divs or something with CSS or p tags or whatever. If you're familiar with HTML and CSS design, where you can design a group of cells, can be part of a group, and they can be horizontal scrolling, vertical scrolling. They can take up different amounts of space on the screen, and so it's very powerful. You can create these really kind of very rich and interesting looking collections, where even some of the collection scrolls vertically, and then if you get to a section of that collection, you can make that section then scroll horizontally. So you can actually have what they call orthogonal scrolling, where you can make certain parts of it scroll orthogonally to the way that the whole thing scrolls. So anyway, there's a lot of really cool APIs built in that are new since iOS 13, and I've been playing with all of them. And while it is a learning curve and a bit difficult, it is, I think, worth it. We're going to put in the show notes, for those of you who are brand new to this, we're all brand new since the first episode, this is going to become both a video on YouTube but also an audio podcast. So when we say show notes, we mean sort of the description in YouTube, or if you're listening to it on a podcast player, it'd be in the show notes itself, that area of your app. But we'll put links to some of the stuff I've talked about here, including some sample code that Apple has. It's an Xcode project that allows you to look at pretty much all of the options you have in both with diffable data sources and with compositional layouts. And you can see they have a bunch of examples of a lot of really cool screens of things that you can do, of kind of what I've been talking about And so I definitely recommend that you check that out. They just updated it for iOS 14 as of dub about a month ago. And so it has some of the newest features that are going to be available to us in iOS 14 as well. So if you get a chance to check it out, I'd encourage you to use the Xcode beta rather than the production Xcode because it contains iOS 14 specific content. So to kind of throw it over to Spencer, have you gotten a chance to take a look at either of those things, or maybe you have a horror story to tell about your use of the previous data source setup? Kind of how has it worked for you, and maybe what are you excited about with that?
Hey guys, future Spencer here. I talked more or less about that. I remember having used it about 6 months ago, and that my experience was really nice because it let us do things such as having very nice animations between table view or collection view updates with the data source. Give us just a second here, and Ben will begin talking and responding here.
Mm-hmm. So that's definitely one of the big advantages with the hashing of the models, so that you can uniquely identify them. It can actually tell what you do is it has a snapshot, right? It has basically a state of things, and then when you go to the new snapshot, you say data source apply the snapshot that you've created. And that can be a brand new snapshot, or it can be actually an amended snapshot from the previous state, either way. And what it does is you say apply snapshot, and then you have an option to animate that or not. It's just a Boolean flag, right? True or false. And so if you choose to animate it, what will actually happen is if the snapshot, let's say, moves a cell from one section to another, it will then animate that movement, or if it deletes it, or if it inserts it, right? The proper animation, whatever it needs to be, will run. Okay, how about now?
Okay, just testing to see if we get audio from me. Thanks for the heads up. Assuming that there is audio from me, that's a really nice part of these diffable data sources, where before you kind of do the catch-all of like collection view or data or table view reload data, and it just it just updates the table view, but there's no nice smooth transition from it. So those are cool, and also the compositional layouts have been something really cool. I've mentioned multiple times to a couple students, like if you want to do a Netflix style layout where you've got, like you're saying, the orthogonal scrolling, it's so much less code and so much less of a headache to have multiple data sources all over in cells, and so I think this is definitely going to be the way, sort of become the standard. I'm excited for when that happens. Dimitri, have you had a chance to look at it? I know,
I haven't actually gotten a chance to take a look at it, but I did do a lot of work with the old style method, where you say these entries have been removed, these entries have been added. And you have to be very careful when using those APIs, because the ordering in which you add things and remove things is not the order in which you did it. It's the final end place of your data that it cares about, and you need to be very careful to order things in that way, because indices, like if you remove something from early on, then the later indexes all get shifted over, so that all gets impacted. And I think one thing that diffable data sources kind of takes care of for you is that it will just do that calculation once and then know exactly where each entry ends up being. One of the most difficult things with managing that yourself used to be that computers are slow, so you need to keep track as you're entering things and as you're removing things. You know exactly where things were added, where things were removed. But now everything is so much faster that we can kind of burn a few extra CPU cycles to just do this in one instant, and I think that's where the most benefits come from. Kind of going back to the whole discussion about a data source as well, something that I found always very interesting is like an NS outline view on the Mac doesn't use a data source like a table view does. It basically asks for all the children of an entry, and then it will go ahead and present all those children. And then when the user expands a child from there, kind of like in the Finder, where you have a folder, and then inside the folder you have another folder, and so on and so forth. You can describe a lot of data that way, but you don't necessarily want to give it all at once. So the system is formatted in a way where it will ask just what those children are of a specific child. And it's kind of already using a very similar system, just from an era long forgotten, because it never really made its way over to iOS, which is also interesting. But that's all implemented with a table view. So just because there are these new technologies doesn't necessarily mean you have to go ahead and do things this way. It's just giving more tools. And I think that's the most beneficial thing of all, is to have more options to put together your user interfaces in these ways.
Yeah. I remember that, well, I don't know if you guys had heard about this, but I remember when I started, learning iOS development 4 or 5 years ago, there was talk of people saying, why do we even have a table view if you can also use a collection view to essentially accomplish the same goal? I don't know how widely debated a topic that is, but I think you're right. Just giving options is a nice thing. So, collection views are great, but there's definitely more setup involved. You always need a custom cell so for those times that you do just want a very quick, basic table view, it's less work for you. I don't know if you guys have heard that or how you guys feel about that kind of sentiment.
I might be wrong with this, but I believe when collection views were actually released, they actually changed out the implementation of table views to use the collection view layout methods internally. So table views just became a different API to using collection views that had a very focused use case in mind. And I actually did the work implementing something that was like a table view. So specifically like spreadsheets work in Excel or in Numbers, you have a two-dimensional layout. You have columns and rows. So I actually wrote something from scratch, not using a table view, not using a collection view, to load that data lazily as it was being requested. And that honestly is a lot of work to get just right. When you do get it working, it's like, it feels so good because you poured many, many dozens of hours into that. But it feels even better when you can delete all that code and use something that is built in the system that you don't have to necessarily manage anymore. Now, of course, you're kind of leaving the keys to your destiny in someone else's hands at that point, but how many keys do you want to have on your key ring is always a question.
Yeah, something to keep in mind for people listening or watching is that all that was just said is all very true. And in fact, with iOS 14, with the diffable data sources and with compositional layout, they have actually added a list type. It's one of the new things they added to the API. So there's now what's called a list type in the collection view APIs for compositional layout. And what that means is you basically get a table view-like presentation using a collection view. So from what I've heard, kind of the rumor mill on Twitter from other iOS devs is that probably the table view, at least for most devs, is going to go away once they can utilize iOS 14 as their base SDK, because we'll just use collection views for everything, and we'll just use a list type or a more kind of traditional collection view style if that's warranted. The personal app that I'm working on, I wanted to enable a couple different ways to show the data, and so what I did was I designed a one-column collection view style that is kind of like a wide and short card view, and then I created a second style which was the same idea, but they were squares, and so they were two per row, creating a grid. So I created the list sort of style and a grid style, and I used collection views. I used a collection view for both, and I actually even used the same cell. What's really cool is the custom cell that I had to create. I had to do all that work, but I only did it once. And so what I do is when I want to swap between them, I simply swap out the layout style, and I apply a different layout to the collection view, whether it's list or grid, and that gives me two different styles of presentation of the same data with the same cells for very little work. I just basically make two functions, one that creates a list style, one that creates a grid style, and then I just swap those out when the user presses the button to switch between them. And so doing that in sort of the old way would have been much more difficult. And this, it's just a matter of 10 lines of code, 15 lines of code for each of the two styles. So it's like 30 lines total, and I get these two totally different presentations.
So Spencer, I hear you've been working on personal projects as well, and specifically around adding iPad user interface to previously iPhone-only apps. Do you mind telling us a bit more about that process?
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, it's been a personal project that it's probably the largest project that the largest personal project that I've worked on. I've been working on it for over a year now, just, very slowly as, just when I have time on the side and everything. Um, and I designed it to be just an iPhone only app. And then, when WWDC came around last year with the introduction of Catalyst, I thought, oh, you know what, I could also make this an iPad app and then I'd get it as a Mac app for free, with, a fairly small amount of tweaking. And as soon as I did that, I realized that the layout, while it looks, in my opinion, fantastic on an iPhone, doesn't really lend itself to being on a larger screen device like an iPad or even a Mac. Um, for example, it's got like a banner image or a poster image of maybe like a movie or a TV show. And while it looks good on an iPhone, the scaling, stretches everything out, becomes very pixelated on a larger screen. And so I began, just going through the, I suppose, normal process of using something like trait variations in the storyboard to have different constraints and whatnot, and using, having different constants and activating different constraints based on the size classes. And while it worked, I could get something working, it didn't feel natural, I suppose, even with moving stack views to be horizontal as opposed to vertical on the iPhone version. It just wasn't quite, didn't feel very clean, I suppose. And maybe that's just due to lack of experience, but I didn't feel great about it. So what I've kind of begun to do, and I kind of wanted to get your feedback on this and see, what do you think? How would you approach this when you do want a relatively drastic change in the interface between, an iPad app and an iPhone app? What I've begun to do is have separate storyboards, and just when the app launches, I check is the idiom an iPad or is it a phone, and then go to different storyboards. The good part about that is that I essentially just copied the storyboard of the iPhone version, pasted it, and then started picking out things, but they're all set up to the same view controller, so I didn't have to write any extra code. It's just double the storyboards essentially, but all of the outlets and the actions and everything is hooked up the same. It's just, visually it's laid out a little bit different. So do you guys have any ideas on like how you feel about that as more experienced developers, or, is there maybe a better way?
So you actually kind of happened down a bit of a historical use of like nibs and storyboards, because they were originally made such that you write the controller logic once and then you swap out the view part of MVC as a whole archived view hierarchy. And that was the whole reason why like view controllers have init with nib name, and so forth, so that we can actually initialize them with different user interfaces in different situations. And now going back to when the iPad first came out, we had two idioms, right? As you mentioned, you had the iPad idiom and you had the iPhone idiom. So Apple is pretty much encouraging you to go down this route. You have two user interfaces that you would swap one for the other. Now, one thing that was missing in those early days of the iPad was multitasking. So that's where I think this kind of approach kind of falls apart. While it is very clean, you essentially have two different apps that you've laid out, and everything is not, like very nice as a result of that. It doesn't really work very well with multitasking as soon as you need to resize that iPad app, because then you need to load up a brand new user interface from nothing, and that can be somewhat jarring because you might lose state. You can't just swap out the views very easily. I mean, you probably could if you're willing to hack enough things, but the system surely does not want to play nice in that regard. So that's kind of where it falls apart whenever I've tried to do something like that. What about you, Ben?
Yeah, for me, I don't know if I think I've worked on an app or two that has taken that approach where they have a couple different storyboards and you just pick one at launch. Typically, what I've done, I guess, really for me, the apps that I built, the UI is not so different that you couldn't reuse the same storyboard. So what I have done to pretty decent success is basically using the trait collections and the turning on and turning off of constraints. So for those of you that may not know, what you can do is you can apply a constraint to a view, and then you can say that this constraint only is active in certain size classes or trait collections, depending on what Apple wants to call them, because they keep changing the name of it. But basically you can say, like, for example, I want a particular constraint. I want this thing to be a certain width, but I only want that to be true when the width of the device is compact. And a compact width device is typically a phone, right? Is one of the phone-sized iOS devices, whereas an iPad has what's called regular size classes, meaning that both the width and the height in both dimensions are regular size. So that constraint would not apply if the app were running on a device that had a regular width. So what you can do is you end up adding, let's say, 2 or 3 times the amount of constraints to a view that it would actually need for one view, and only some of them are turned on for some views, or sorry, some size classes, and some are not. And then when the device runs, when the app runs on a device, it then figures out what needs to be done. And so that's great. You can even do things like you can move a view. You can say the view exists here, and you can say, like, I want to basically detach all these constraints when we're in a different size class, and I want to make it essentially a whole different set of constraints. And the effect is that the view can literally move to a different part of the screen, or it can be a different shape or size. And so you can get a very different looking view where the components are still the same, but it's like where they are and how big they are is different. It's also useful for going between portrait and landscape, even on a phone, because compared to an iPad, an iPhone's dimensions are much more drastic. So like if you go landscape, you get a lot of width and you don't get very much height at all. So that can really screw up your layout if it's hard to be that adaptable, basically.
I've definitely thought about, especially getting into like, I believe it's like the 1/3 split view on an iPad where it's about the same width as an iPhone. And maybe I can try to incorporate that as like somewhat of a hybrid approach between what I'm doing now, but also making sure that everything looks good using, split view and everything. So, but that's good to know that more or less, aside from multitasking, getting into the split views, that's sort of like a normal condoned thing. I had never heard of it before, and maybe that's just, due to not having as much experience, but it's good to know that that's not like a completely just, out of left field idea to have multiple storyboards, I guess.
Yeah.
So,
I mean,
now the out of left field idea is to do everything programmatically, which is kind of like what I would do.
Sure.
Because one problem with like an iPad, for instance, is landscape is significantly wider than portrait. If you have a toolbar full of buttons, they're not necessarily going to fit on portrait if they do fit on landscape. And you might just go ahead and accept that fact and say, okay, I'm just going to have less controls available, even if the device is in landscape, just so that way when I rotate it, all the constraints will work out for me. Mm-hmm. But an alternative route that you can do is to do things programmatically. So we kind of like to say that that SwiftUI, for instance, is what's the term for that? It's a type of user interface layout that is deterministic.
Declarative.
No. Declarative.
Declarative, yes.
Yeah.
So you declare what your user interface looks like,
Sure.
and then you just pass the data to make that happen. Well, view controllers can be declarative too if you use something like viewable layout or layout subviews if you're in a UI view itself. You can go ahead and describe every situation that your entire hierarchy should organize itself, and then you can go ahead and be much more specific. Hey, if I only have this many pixels wide, then I'm going to lay out like this. But if I have more than that, but less than this, I can go out and lay out like this, and go through all of them. Now, this is a nightmare if you're working with other people, because it might make sense to one person or your past self and not anyone else. But if it's the kind of work that can kind of be done once and then not touched, it lends itself quite well to that. And then, of course, there's Swift UI, where you can go ahead and do just that, and then you have something that is relatively easy to parse and read after the fact, especially if you group your views properly. And it's kind of going back to that. So even though we're still using UIKit, we still get those benefits from Swift UI, which is supposedly the only way to program that way, which, spoiler alert, it isn't. You can use the same techniques in many different ways. But it goes to show you that there are many, many different ways to do the exact same thing and to solve the exact same problem. And it's difficult to kind of get boxed in and say, oh, this is the only way, because then you don't necessarily know how to have something work in different situations than what you assumed from the very beginning.
Totally.
Yeah, I was going to add that I generally am a fan of, right tool for the right job. I'm not sort of beholden to one camp or the other, but I will say that with the switch to compositional layout and diffable data sources, they definitely lend themselves much more to being a purely programmatic UI. So I have actually, both in my personal app that I'm working on and also the app I'm working on for my job, I've switched to programmatic for everything. And I'm down to, I think in each case, I'm down to one view left in the storyboard. And it's just, I haven't changed it yet because I haven't yet had a need, but I'm going to be getting rid of that and going all programmatic. And I see the value there with that. It's not as immediate, right? Because you can't see what you're doing as you do it necessarily as easily, but it definitely gives you a lot more control over exactly what you want it to do and how you want it to look.
Yeah, that makes sense. I have tried somewhat of a similar approach, Dimitri, to what you said, where on a different iPad app, I had made a bunch of constraints in the storyboard, and I was just activating them programmatically, and that itself was a ton of work, but maybe doing it completely programmatically might be a better solution than me sitting there and activating and deactivating, or maybe it ends up being the same thing. But I ended up splitting up my view controller file because it had a collection view in it, it had a table view, and some other views, and it ended up being, 1,500 plus lines of code because I was just activating based on different situations, and it was a lot of work.
Yeah, definitely. I was going to say something, but I completely forgot. Happens.
It's all right.
In any case, for our last topic, Apple's App Store has been in the news again lately, even though it was just in the news not too many weeks ago. So as someone who has been in the App Store since almost day one, and has certainly been a user of it since it came out, I wanted to talk a little bit about what I think could make the App Store a better place for both developers and users. So let's rewind a bit. And when the App Store came out, a history lesson here. So when the App Store came out, it was something with a very small number of apps available on it. You could go to the App Store. It was relatively unorganized. If you've ever been in App Store Connect, it asks you for a category. That was the categorization that was available on it. So you can go to a category and you can browse the roughly 50 to 100 apps within that category. And you can go to the next category and check those out. And I personally remember, when the App Store just came out, I was buying apps all the time because there were so many to just go and check out, but they were not buried amongst a whole bunch of cruft. It was just available. And it kind of mimics how a physical store works. You go and you see all the aisles and you can browse the aisles. You have a few options for a specific category of thing, but apart from that, you can look through those three options. You can buy all those three options if you wanted to test them out, and then you can go ahead and make your decision as far as which app you wanted to continuously use from that point forward. Now, there were some problems with this. One, users got to the point where they expected all app updates to come for free forever. and never be charged a dime. Two, the number of apps in the App Store kind of very quickly, grew to the point where competition was on who can make the app for the smallest amount of money and sell the most of them. So we had a race to the bottom situation where almost every app became $1 or free. And then once in-app purchases came out, then almost everything was free. And then you have in-app purchases. And then as soon as subscriptions came out, you have sneaky subscriptions that are behind some like small trial amount. And then every 7 days, you're charged $15 for the right to use the app. So we kind of got into that hole. Now, it makes sense why Apple wants to control the App Store, because their trust is on the line from their point of view, right? Everyone's coming to the App Store with the assumption that Apple kind of looked at everything, and Apple wants the best apps there are to be featured and to be showcased to the users. Now, a problem is there's so many that even if you do go through the effort of making an excellent app, you have a very small chance of actually being featured by Apple because they're just looking at volumes more apps than the amount of work that you put in yours. It almost becomes not worth it to put very much effort into an app, so you end up with lower quality apps as a result. You might have a developer go all in and make an excellent app, but unfortunately, they might never get recognized for that, so therefore they stop making apps. And that's not really a situation that is beneficial to anyone. As I mentioned, you have those scammy apps that somehow get in, and we have no idea why those are allowed, but then something that does something legitimate for whatever reason, it's not even a rule, gets flagged by app review, and then all their apps are removed from everything all at once, which happened this week as well. So there's all sorts of tricky situations that Apple has kind of gotten itself into, and it's precisely because they kind of want to allow everyone, but they also want to maintain some level of quality to kind of guard themselves with. Now, I think this might have worked when it was only 500 to a few thousand apps, but now that they're, I don't know how many there are,
Like
probably
2 million, I think.
Yeah, it's an outrageous number of software that's out there. Like one single store doesn't make sense for all of that. It's like saying all of the internet is gated by YouTube, by Google. Like to get to the internet, you have to go through Google, and Google indexes everything. And that worked for Yahoo. Yahoo had an index of everything, but then that suddenly no longer works because it got too big. So I think Apple needs to take a slightly different approach here, where if they want to have a store, they need to have a curated store where they can have much more strict rules. Like you can only get in if you meet every bar of quality that Apple considers it like necessary. You have accessibility, you have all of the localizations, you have a design sense, and you have everything set up for success. And then they'll let you into that store. You need to have, if they go this route, they will end up essentially having just the best apps of the best apps. There will no longer be an excuse for things that are half-assed ending up right next to things that are very, very polished. You won't have updates that suddenly turn a previously great app because it got sold into something that's super scammy and trying to leech money off of people. So if you have this very focused store, that lets Apple be much more lenient with everything else. So they can have their store, which will curate everything to the highest degree possible, but then everything else will also need to go through Apple. This way they can prevent things like malware, things like illegal scams, things that do things that Apple just does not want to be anywhere near associated with, but it doesn't need to be something that Apple actually has a storefront for. So you can upload your app if you're a student. A student doesn't have a ton of resources to make the most polished app in the world. Currently, if they try to upload an app, they might get rejected because, oh, hey, we have 100 of these already. We don't want another one. And that's heartbreaking for a student wanting to get in. But if a student can submit their app, not be fearful of those types of consequences, but it's also not on a store. If they want their friend to download it, they can send them a link directly. I think that'll work a lot better. It'll allow companies that don't necessarily want to share income with Apple. They don't necessarily need to share income with Apple. They're sharing income with the $99 yearly membership fee, and then they can get their app not listed but approved for distribution. So Apple still vends the app, the IPA, but everyone else will kind of download it via direct link. It's up to you at that point to do the marketing. Now, for the store, this means that we'll need something like an editorialized process where you can submit, kind of like app review, but at the very least, oh, hey, not all these screens were polished enough, so we don't want to have them on the store. So you have something you can act on. Now, this can be limited. You can't do this more than twice a month, for instance. You can't scam Apple, not scam. You can't spam Apple by submitting multiple tries at trying to sneak your way through. You only have a limited chances. You don't want to screw those up, so you're going to save them, and you're going to try to do your very best before even putting your first build their way. But that allows you to still build your business in relatively fear-free way where you can go ahead and distribute your app normally. So I've long held this opinion, watching the App Store grow and kind of self-implode from the amount of apps within it. So I'm curious to hear what your opinions are of this, especially you, Ben, since you're working on an app that you're about to put on the App Store.
Yeah, I think I've heard lots of different opinions. I've heard the opinion that you shared, Dimitri. I've heard a bunch of other sort of different ways to do it, and I think there's definitely things that Apple is doing for if you're complaining about the 30%, right? Like you're not doing that, but like if there are people who are arguing that 30% itself is what is punitive and unfair and all that kind of thing, and that should be lower. Famously, the Basecamp people were complaining about that, DHH in particular, about that being too high and all that kind of thing. I think there's more. I think Apple's doing more that is not obvious, sort of to earn that 30%. At the same time, I do feel like it's probably higher than it needs to be, and certainly their very almost vindictive attitude towards. If you make $1 with any of our stuff, we deserve a cut no matter what. I feel like that's definitely just not from a PR perspective, not a great way to go, on Apple's part. But as far as giving users more choice, right, both developers and users more choice to be able to distribute, to sell, and on the consumer side to consume and to purchase and use applications. I think having alternate ways to do that would be good. We want to be very careful that we don't break the kind of delicate relationship that exists between developers and users from a security and safety and privacy and sort of the integrity of your data point of view. Apple has built over a long time a very solid reputation of if you download an app from the App Store, for the most part, your data will be safe. Your data will be. It's difficult for people to take it from you, and to do things that they shouldn't be doing with it. Obviously, you can name a whole bunch of counterexamples to that, but in general, the reputation is a solid one, and certainly one that Apple would want to make sure they don't do too much to ruin. But there has to be a way. Certainly, it exists on the Mac, right? There has to be a way that we could vend software to the iPhone or to any of the iOS sort of ecosystem of devices, where it is signed, it is secure, it is safe, and yet it is not distributed through the App Store itself, because that's really just a storefront, just a mechanism for people to download. There are other ways to do it. I mean, the enterprise distribution channels are also largely very secure and very safe, and yet they don't go through the App Store. So it's definitely true and possible that you can do this. Whether Apple will or not, I don't know. I have a feeling that they won't do it unless they are forced. So unless essentially the U.S. government and other governments around the world force them to do so through antitrust or regulatory measures to make that more competitive, I don't think that they're probably going to do it, because in part they are increasingly relying on service revenue to be profitable. Not that they're not otherwise profitable, but it's becoming a bigger and bigger chunk of their revenue, and I'm sure they're not in any big hurry to get rid of that 30% cash cow that they've been enjoying. Every time they show off that big check, which they haven't done in a while, on dev events where they show however many billions of dollars they give into devs, there's an additional 30% on top of that they get to keep, and I'm sure they're not in any big hurry to get rid of that. So I think it's of course it's a more complex issue than anyone on Twitter or anywhere else is probably willing to admit, because these things are always more complex than they seem at sort of at the surface level. But I do feel like there are technical and sort of business process ways that this could be changed, largely for the better. And on the other hand, I would say that I think people who are complaining about wanting to not be on the App Store might find it to be a more lonely existence out in the wild, doing their own marketing from scratch than they might sort of think right now, right? Like it's easy to say that, yeah, I'll do it all myself and I'll do it much better. I'll keep all the money and it'll be great. It's like, yeah, it's true, but that's a lot more work than anybody I think is willing to maybe, or than a lot of people are willing to give it credit for. I mean, this effort right here, what you're watching and listening to right now, code completion, this is a new venture for all of us on the show. And it's going to be one where we're going to have to market and build this from nothing, just like you do any business. And it, even in just the few weeks that it sort of existed for us and this premiere episode, it hasn't been without hiccups, and I'm sure there's a lot more for us to learn, and there's a lot more work for us to do to make it so that people who want to understand this better will know that our show even exists, right? Let alone actually watch or listen to it. And I think parallels are definitely true there for app development and app marketing. Is it's easy to think of an idea, and it's relatively easy to build that idea. The really hard part is to get people to know that it exists and that they should download it, they should buy it, they should subscribe, they should purchase your coins, your in-app purchase coins, or whatever it might be. All those conversion opportunities are a lot harder to accomplish than you might think. And without the backing of the App Store, I feel like it really is just going to be even. Not that it's not hard now; it's going to be even harder beyond that. Spencer, what do you think about this? Have you considered releasing an app, and if so, how would you prefer to do it? Would you rather do it the way that it is now, or do you think you'd prefer a world where you kind of put your stake on the web somewhere domain and you kind of go grassroots?
Yeah, I have a few thoughts on this. As far as what Dimitri brought up, I think your idea is really interesting. Having some curated content, and along with that, I think for me, what makes the most sense is like you brought up, Ben, where they open up the environment just like it's on, like Apple themselves are doing on Macs, where if you want, you can distribute your app outside of the App Store. To me, that is, if I agree with you that you said there's a lot going on behind the scenes that maybe we don't realize, and that's why they take 30%. But I also think having the ability to leave the App Store if you choose is something that is, should be an option for us, because right now we're in our walled garden, and even Tim Cook, when he brought up in that Senate hearing, or congressional hearing, whatever it was, he said, oh, well, other developers can also go to the Xbox Game Store or the PlayStation Store. I'm like, not really, because I am an iOS developer. I do not develop games for game consoles, or I'm not an Android developer. It's not quite as cut and dry like that. And so I think them just giving us a little bit of freedom would be something that would take a lot of the heat off of them, and personally would make me happy just to have the opportunity, even if I don't necessarily exercise that opportunity, right? Yeah. I mean, that's exactly why. I mean, part of this, I think, is why things like the alt store exist. If you guys have heard of that, right? Where you sort of sideload apps and it runs through your 7-day signing, and it's kind of a whole thing. Obviously, there are apps on there that clearly break Apple's sort of code of conduct, but at the same time, Apple's own rules, like we've talked about, are a little bit unfair. Where, for example, I don't know, Netflix or whatever cannot offer to, or how does it work? Let's see, they can't
So they can't.
You can only log in.
Yeah, you can't promote any
Right.
purchase, right? Because it doesn't go through Apple's in-app purchase.
Yes. Right, exactly. But then Apple doesn't take a cut of that.
Right.
So I think also another really interesting thing that I heard a couple months ago was when I don't really follow much with like game development or anything, but I did see that a few months ago when they announced the new Unreal Engine 5 that they said, hey, we are going to let you guys, we'll license out this engine to you for free. You can make all the games you want. You don't have to pay us until you start making $1 million.
Yeah.
And then we get 5%. I think that's an interesting idea too, to like motivate people to get on the App Store, and maybe, Dimitri, like you were saying, try to get up to a very high standard where, hey, up to $10,000, up to $100,000, whatever it is, you take everything, and then from there we then start taking a percentage of the revenue. You know what I mean? That would be something that would, if they did open up the walled garden, that would be somewhat of a motivator to also keep them in, while also gaining the benefit of everything Apple does, like curating this and making it easy for you to find apps.
I mean, certainly it can be argued that part of the 30% goes towards paying for the APIs that you're using.
Yeah.
I mean, Apple's APIs are some of the best APIs. No matter how much we begrudge Xcode and the lack of documentation, the APIs are fantastic. That's why we are Apple platform developers and not developers for other things, because we enjoy building apps with all the tools that Apple gives us, so we don't have to work on building the plumbing of the app. We get to work on solving the problem our app solves. It's just such a shame that we are limited from using these tools for any idea whatsoever, regardless of what Apple thinks, oh, this should be allowed or this shouldn't be allowed. Like being able to build something that is truly open. I mean, the Mac has benefited like so much from this, and that's what built up the Mac. Now, I'm not saying that we should allow anyone to download anything, because like on the Mac you can still download POS software that will go ahead and tank everything and steal your credit cards through Safari. And yes, it will be sandbox, quote unquote. And there's only so much Apple can do to really tie down the system without a human component to really make sure that someone isn't skirting around the rules, like a certain governmental system. So like just having the framework in place to prevent that is not enough, I don't think. I think we still need that human element, and Apple recognizes that. So like if everything did still go through them, but they had a much more lax set of rules, like you can have emulators, because we're not going to put this on our store. We're not going to advertise this, but it's not really causing users harm. So we're not going to necessarily get in the way either. I mean, there are tons of apps that are just not distributed through quote-unquote legal means. They're all through enterprise certificates, because that's the only way you can do it. And I think Apple allows it because there's a whole set of industries that are relying on it now, because like it or not, people want to use iPhones for things rather than Android devices, and that's the way it is. And one more thing that you brought up, Ben, as well, like as indies, we kind of end up in the situation where Apple is not doing us any favors by having this big app store.
Right.
Like, we're never going to be seen regardless, so we have to do the marketing. We have to do everything. It's the big company that is like benefiting from Apple the most, but the small people that make the really cool apps that tend to be noticed by people, like it's a team of 2 or 3 people.
Right.
Maybe it grows over time, and that's excellent. That's a success story if it grows over time, right? But it starts off as one person building an app, and it happened to get noticed.
Right.
On the Mac, it didn't happen to get noticed. It got noticed because everyone's a tight-knit community of Mac developers, and they're welcoming to get you in and to get you up to the same level of quality as they all are.
Right.
Like, it's such a supportive community. Whereas on the iOS store, you're kind of fighting for eyeballs more than anything, rather than actually trying to make good quality software as a community. And I think that's what's like really lacking about the iOS App Store. I mean, on the Mac, you make more money selling software on the Mac than you do on iOS, because you can market it yourself. Like, that is a condemnation of anything of the App Store's gated policy, because like it's a whole different market, really.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with you on some of that. I would probably push back a little bit on some of the community type stuff. If we're talking about from like from a developer's perspective, I've intentionally kind of curated my Twitter experience. I don't know, I think like starting last year, where I decided that I wanted to use Twitter as a network, as something that I could interact and engage with other iOS developers specifically on. So, because the conversation is great and it's easy and quick, and people can share screenshots and video and all kinds of stuff, and it's just very open and very welcoming in that part. I mean, there are definitely parts of Twitter that are not welcoming, but sort of iOS dev Twitter I found to be very, very welcoming. And so
Oh,
I
definitely.
have curated my sort of follow list, and kind of everything about my Twitter experience basically is kind of focused around iOS development. And it's been great for me. And I've learned a ton, and I feel like that community that you talked about with Mac developers, that does exist for iOS. If we're talking about specifically indies, people that are building small apps, that maybe do one or a couple of things really well. And I also would kind of push back on, it is possible to make good money and do well on the iOS App Store, as an indie. I mean, take Slopes, Curtis Herbert's ski tracking app. It's probably, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, literally the best. I don't even ski, but the best ski and snowboard tracking application probably on the planet. It's very much an iOS app in every possible way, from a design point of view, from an implementation of the modern features and frameworks. He really dives deep on all that stuff, and he really, really sweats the small stuff. And it's his primary source of income. And while probably most people don't know who he is or what the app is or whatever, among the community of developers that I am part of, he's definitely, part of that conversation. And I would say that probably, I mean, again, I live in Florida, so I don't even know how to ski, but I would imagine that because it's just so amazingly good, he's probably got a lot of fans in the skiing community. And he's able to build and sustain a profitable business. So it is definitely doable. It's difficult. It's very hard to do well. And I think in some ways Apple's policies kind of inadvertently help you to make that easier, right? And then in some other ways, and these are both ways that are not super obvious, right? They hurt you, right? It may not even be that obvious that this policy is, one of them is bad, but it actually is holding you back, right? And so it's
Actively prevents you from exploring
yeah,
something.
so it's I think it's definitely very much a double-edged sword. Like it's good in some ways, bad in others, and I'm not a fan of any sort of these opinions out there that are like, the App Store is amazing, we'd all be nothing without it, there's no reason to complain at all. And it's like, well, that's not a great argument. And also it's terrible and we should burn it down, and Apple's terrible for making it. And like those very like strong dichotomies in opinion just don't seem to hold up with sort of what I see from like the reality on the ground. It's a lot more of a kind of some of A, some of B. Like it's some of it's good, some of it's bad, and you just you got to deal with it and do the best you can.
Yeah. I think one thing that makes it more hard for iOS developers though is just the sheer numbers, where
Yeah,
I think there are only tens of thousands of apps in the Mac App Store,
right.
but then we're approaching, if not at 2 million. It's just a larger game that you have to play,
Yeah,
and you, like Dimitri said, you need to be the best in whatever category you're in, or maybe it was Ben that said that, to really sort of even get recognized at
yeah.
all, or find some super niche that just no one has found yet.
Whereas on the Mac App Store, you can sell like 10 copies one day, and suddenly you're like at the top of one of the charts because because there's
Yeah,
just so
exactly.
much less competition. There's just so many fewer apps on the Mac App Store than there are on the iOS App Store.
Definitely.
So this week's episode of Code Completion is brought to you by Huuungry. So Huuungry, that's Hungry with 3 U's, is the iPhone, iPad, and Apple Watch app you turn to when you really want to eat, but are blinded by the multitude of choices available to you and your insatiable hunger. Huuungry isn't here to help you discover new restaurants or flavors. No, it has a much more humble purpose. You tell it all about your favorite restaurants, and it will deploy its cryptographically advanced random number generator, invoked by shaking your phone in frustration, to make the decision of what to eat for you. Stuck at home in quarantine and sick of ordering pizza? Use Huuungry. Did Huuungry just suggest pizza again? Don't fret. as options for another cuisine, a cheaper option, something closer, or simply another option are just a button away. Huuungry also comes with a collection of fun animated iMessage stickers, so you can share your hunger with others. Thanks again to Huuungry for sponsoring our show. Search for Huuungry, that's Huuungry, on the App Store today to give it a try.
Nice.
Okay, so now that we've gone through our topics, we thought we might quiz our listeners on your knowledge of Swift, Apple, and all things development. Ben, can you take it away?
Sure. So we've got a new segment on a new show called Complete the Code. So for the first one, we've got a little Swift puzzle for you. So if you're watching the stream or watching the YouTube video, you see it here on your screen. And if you're listening to it as a podcast, please check the show notes for an image of the code that we're talking about. Or if you have a podcast player that supports chapter art, we're going to make this the chapter art for this particular chapter. So kind of however you're consuming this, you should be able to get a look at the code itself. So without further ado, this particular challenge is as you see here, and the question we want to ask you is, without using a variable as a flag, how can you skip to the next iteration of the outer loop from inside the inner loop? So for, again, those listening, if you don't have quite ready access to it, there's basically two for loops here. One is nested inside the other, and then inside that inner for loop there is an if statement that either is going to be true or false. And within that statement, we want to figure out a way to skip the inner loop and also this last line here, finish up row, and go to the next iteration of the row. There's a rows for loop and a columns for loop, and so we're trying to figure out how to do that. There is essentially a couple small changes you can make to this code to make that work. And how we're going to reveal the answer is we will do it next week on our next stream live on the show. So if you please take your guesses, and if you want to know the answer, make sure to check us out next week, where we're going to show off the answer for this week and then give you the new prompt that we've got for you for next time.
So if you have an answer to that, don't forget to tweet at us with hashtag complete the code, so that way we can see who answers first and we can give them a shout out. Our DMs are open, so if you have your own little quizzes that you'd like to share with us, we are more than happy to receive those. Otherwise, you're going to slowly start hearing more and more difficult questions of real problems that we're having that we just don't know the answers to. So please help us out by sharing with us some simpler quizzes that don't necessarily involve our full-time work. So with all of that out of the way, it's time for Compiler Error, a segment where I get to test all of your knowledge about Swift, Apple, and all things development. So if you've ever played the game Science or Fiction at home, the rules should be instantly recognizable. I'm going to read out some statements, most of which are factual, or valid code completions, if you will, while one of them is an outright made-up lie, aka the compiler error. The best part, it's up to each of you to use your master debugging techniques to determine which one is the error. So today I have 4 questions that all follow a theme, and that theme is Unicode names for Mac modifier keys. So give me a moment while
I'm on the very edge of my seat on that one.
So my pre-prepared screenshot is not going through. But Spencer and Ben, I did share something in Slack for you to use as reference. Cool. And let me go out and read these statements. So I have 4 statements. Once again, one of them is the compiler error. That will be completely fictitious, whereas the other 3 will be completely true. So the first statement, known as the key with the Apple logo, the command key has been represented by the Unicode character known as place of interest sign since the Apple III. Second statement, used on many systems that are very different from Mac's, the control key on macOS differentiates itself from the competition by using the up arrowhead Unicode character rather than the abbreviation, bar, or traditional caret notations. Statement number 3, located between the control and command keys on the keyboard, the option key is unoriginally called option key in the Unicode specification, but was also known as the closed Apple key on Apple II series computers. And statement number 4. Despite being used on some of the earliest computers, the shift modifier on Apple keyboards simply uses the upwards white arrow character, an approximation of the standardized level 2 select key's original symbol. So I'm not saying that the names are incorrect. I'm not saying that the statements are incorrect. But there is one thing about one of these statements that is outright a lie, and it is up to you to use your debugging skills to find it. Spencer, why don't we start with you?
Ooh, okay. I am sort of thinking it's either 2 or 3. I think my question with number 2 is just my lack of knowledge here. When I think of the control key, I would think like the traditional caret, but then I'm not sure what the up arrowhead specifically refers to. So I'm wondering if it's because of that I'm a little confused here. And also, I'm just not quite sure. My knowledge of old Apple computers is not great. So I haven't been a Mac user for that long. So as far as having it be called the closed Apple key, I'm not quite sure. Ben, what do you think?
Shifting it over to Ben.
Okay.
Trying to shirk responsibility here.
Interesting. I thought we could have a discussion, a conversation.
Nope.
Ooh, man.
You have a 1 in 4 chance.
I know. That's not great odds.
No.
Man. I'll go with number 2.
All right.
Number 2. Okay, Ben?
So for me, I'm gonna cheat a little. I happen to have a Mac keyboard in front of me. Number 1, the place of interest sign. I know that is true because I've actually had to look up what that character glyph is called in the character viewer, and it's called that. I don't know why, but I'm assuming it was probably something else. And then Apple sort of took it and used it for their own purposes. So I'm fairly certain that number 1 is true. Number 2, if I look at the caret symbol versus the control symbol, the 2 glyphs that are on those keys above the 6 and above the control key, the sort of the angle of the arrow is not the same. The control key arrow is wider than the one that represents the caret, so I'm assuming that they are not the same glyph. So up arrowhead is a decent name for that. I don't know if that's actually accurate, but that does seem reasonable. So I'm going with 2 is true. So then what we have left are the option key, which is the super weird. Now that I'm actually looking at it carefully, almost looks kind of like a very sort of stylized version of like the USS Enterprise in profile. I don't know why I never saw that before, but it has like this vaguely starship kind of shape. And that's the key that nobody can ever sort of recognize. Like when you're telling someone to do something, like press these keys, you're like, press the option key. It looks like, and then they try and describe that glyph, and it always comes out very strangely. So closed Apple key, that doesn't seem right because, I mean, other than maybe naming it after Apple because Apple used it, it doesn't seem to have any relationship to that. So it's reasonable, maybe choice for being the lie, but let me look at number 4 real quick. Upwards. Yeah, so then the shift key, I have a modern Mac keyboard, and it doesn't actually have the arrow on the shift key anymore. It just literally has the word shift written on it. So I do remember what the shift key arrow looked like on old Mac keyboards. And then this standardized level 2 select key's original symbol, sure. My knowledge of old Mac, my old Mac trivia is not that great either. We need to get Andrew Manson on the show. He would ace this entire quiz. But I'm going with 3 because I don't feel confident about this closed Apple key thing. But that is an educated guess at best. Number 3.
Okay, since you both all agree that number 4, where the shift key uses the upwards white arrow character, you both agree that is a code completion and is true, and that is indeed true.
Nice.
So the shift key on on Mac OS keyboards use the upwards white arrow, which is also used in the menus when you look at the little glyph for the modifier key. Now, that is just an approximation of what the standardized key actually was, and that is the level 2 select key. And I guess because it's in some weird standardization and it wasn't in Unicode at the time, that people just started using white arrow, or maybe Apple liked the white arrow better than that representation. I'm not too sure, but that is indeed true. And now let's go in reverse since we're already at 4. Now, Ben, you think number 3 is the compiler error, but Spencer, you think it is true. So located between the control and command keys on the keyboard, the option key is unoriginally called option key in the Unicode specification, but what was also known as the close Apple key on Apple II series computers. Now we refer to it as the closed Apple key because there was also an open Apple key. So that is indeed true. So that is another code completion. So that leaves us with 2 left.
Wow.
So let's go with number 2, keeping in that order. So used on many systems that are very different from Macs, the control key on macOS differentiates itself from the competition by using the up arrowhead Unicode character rather than the abbreviation bar or caret. And those are all the characters that other systems use. So some systems will use Alt as the abbreviation. Some systems will use a vertical bar to represent the option. And some systems will use the caret notation, so that is indeed true. That Macs will not use any of those and use the up arrowhead, as you pointed out, Ben. And that, of course, leaves number 1, which is known as the key with the Apple logo. The command key has been represented by the Unicode character known as interest sign since the Macintosh was introduced in 1984, so that's all true. But though the command key itself was present on Apple III computers introduced in 1980, it was represented by an open Apple logo instead. So the place of interest sign was not actually used until the Macintosh. So you had two Apple keys on your keyboard, one closed and one open. I found that trivia very interesting, and that's what kind of inspired this whole thing.
Nice.
So I hope you both enjoyed that.
Red herring there. Place of sign. Because as soon as I saw that, I was like, I've had to look that up as well. I know that's right. So well done there.
Yeah. Good job, Dimitri.
So I hope to prepare one of these for each week, and hopefully it doesn't take too much research, but it's fun research. So you get to trick all of you. Best part. So I want to personally thank everyone for watching live and listening this week. We've been planning this for quite a while, as Ben has said, and we have much more to share with you over the coming months, including some new faces. But we'll wait for those endeavors to take a little bit longer before revealing them. So we'll be streaming every Friday. So be sure to follow us on Twitter at Codecompletion. That's CODECOMPLETION. So Codecompletion on Twitter to know when new episodes go live and get released. Be sure to also sign up for a monthly newsletter on our website at codecompletion.io. So we plan on releasing this once a month. It'll be a recap of everything we talked about on the show, a bit more about what we learn throughout the month, and we'll also reveal all answers to our quizzes like Complete the Code, and share even more things that we find. And most importantly, is a new podcast. Please be sure to share this with your friends and family who are also interested in any part of the process of app development. It's your support that enables us to continue doing this. And we really hope to grow a healthy community around these topics. So that way we can go ahead and share all the cool stuff that we know about. So once again, I want to give my thanks to Ben, who is Guy, that's FERROUSGUY on Twitter. Spencer, who is at Spencer C. Curtis, that's SPENCERCURT.
IS.
Sorry, that ended up on a different line for some reason on Twitter. For joining me this week. My name once again is Dimitri, and you can find me at Dimitriol, that's DIMITRIOL, and we'll see you all next week.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Thanks.